Hi, everybody. It's Larry Kotlikoff with Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm delighted to have back Uri Dadush, my very good longtime friend, grad school classmate, going back to 1973. I met Uri. We were both at Harvard in the PhD program in economics. Uri was partly in the business school program. I was doing business and economics PhD, and I remember the very first time I met him, I was completely lost where to go. The very first day, we hadn't gone to any classes, and I'm in the lobby of the main building, and Uri comes up to me and says, "I'm lost. Can you help me find out where to go to class? I'm in the PhD program in economics." I said, "Well, just follow me." And ever since then, he's been taking my advice and doing exactly what I say. No, no, it's been sometimes a trying experience because every time he doesn't really want to play chess with me because he's like miles better. And he doesn't really want to remember the fact that I actually played him to a draw at some point in our graduate experience. And he doesn't have any recollection of that. So there's some problem here with our relationship. But the main thing is we're going to talk today about the disintegration of global trade, because Uri is probably the world's leading expert on international trade. And what we are all kind of concerned about in the back of our minds is whether the world is splitting up into 2 or 3 different trading zones because of the the alliance that seems to be evolving between Russia and China, where India is going to play a role in all this. Is Africa going to be, and South America going to be in China's camp? Will the U.S. in trying to oppose Chinese development and economic hegemony, because there's good reason to believe that China is going to be about 2.5 times the size of our economy at the end of the century. Are the Europeans and our other trading partners going to head off with China if we try and block trade with China? So all these kinds of questions are floating around. Uri's the expert. Uri, after he graduated, I think within 3 years at Harvard, which was unheard of at the time, went to work for Data Resources Incorporated, which was the kind of at the cutting edge of data analytics, econometrics, and forecasting back at that time. And then he went to work for the Economist magazine and worked in the Economist Business Division, where he's running their international business. So the Economist magazine also has a company that does economic consulting worldwide. Uri ended up running that entire operation outfit, and then he started working later on where the World Bank, had a second enormously successful career, very high level official at the World Bank, involved in international economics research and forecasting the global economy for the World Bank, and then left the World Bank to start yet another career working with the Carnegie Foundation. And now he's got on his 4th career. Uri, could you just for a moment fill in all these careers, and also the fact that you were born in Tunisia, if I got this right?
Libya.
Libya, I always get it mixed up.
Right.
Libya, born in Libya, Jewish family, gets expelled with basically the shirts on their back from Libya to Italy, and then makes his way to the Hebrew University for undergraduate education, and goes to Harvard graduate school for economics. And so Uri speaks how many languages?
4, Larry, 4.
More?
Four.
Okay, four language, French,
French, English, Italian, and Hebrew.
Hebrew. Okay. All right. That's enough. That's two more than me. So, okay. Did I do justice by your background, or do you need to add anything?
No, just to say that as usual, you've been far too generous. And the reason I've had so many careers is people keep firing me and I have to reinvent myself every time. That's the only reason.
You do remember my getting to a draw with you in chess at some point, don't you?
I don't really remember that, Larry.
Okay. This is the big problem in our relationship. It took me years to get you to get to a draw, many games, and okay. Anyway,
Right.
I think on my gravestone it's going to say, "Got a draw with Uri Dadush in chess."
Right.
Okay, let's talk about the disintegration of world trade. Maybe starting with China. In one of your recent articles, you point out that China's was a kind of a small share of the world, had the small share of the world export market going back maybe 20 years ago, before they became a member of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And now where are they and where are things headed?
So China is now the world's largest exporter of goods. It's very close to the United States in terms of overall trade. And it is the largest trading partner for about 140 out of 200 countries. So the whole discussion you keep hearing, Larry, about, does China fit into the trading system that the United States largely created after World War II, is the wrong question to ask, because as a practical matter, China is already central to the trading system and becoming more important. And therefore, the more interesting question is, how does the rest of the world adjust? How does the trading system adjust to China's rise? Not the other way around.
Right. And what's your take on the way the current, let's say, non-adjustment is occurring, where things are heading? Are we heading to a world where the U.S. puts up tariffs, and we have politicians who are trying every which way to figure out to blame China for, for everything bad that's going on, not just COVID, but other things? They're worried about China stealing our intellectual property. They're worried about China spying on us through TikTok. They're trying to block China, Huawei, that technology companies, introduction of 5G throughout the world. Is any of this justified? You're the president of the United States, what would your position be on China? Would it be Joe Biden's position?
So virtually all the problems you mentioned about China, intellectual property, lack of protection of it, subsidization, etc., are real issues. And they have been around for a long time, and they look like, at least on the subsidization issue and on issues like the emphasis on state-owned enterprises, looks like these things are going to stick around for a long time, because under Xi Jinping, and certainly after the global financial crisis, China's market-oriented reforms of the traditional type, de-emphasizing the state sector, those have slowed. Some people say they're being reversed. Some people say they've ground to a halt. what's for sure is that the momentum of market reforms has finished. It's not there now. Maybe it will come back, but it doesn't look like we're in that direction at the moment. So that's correct. However, there are two other factors to consider when you're the president of the United States, since that's the question you're asking. One factor is security. And these issues, the security, the geopolitical competition, etc., have now become much more central to US policy than was the case a few years ago. A few years ago, the trade issue was paramount with China. Now the security and geopolitical questions are paramount, about geopolitical competition, about rivalry. So that's one that's much more important now, much more salient. The other has to do more with the United States than with China or any other country, which is that fundamentally the United States body politic has become ambivalent about international trade and about the trading system that the United States created, especially the rules of the WTO, of the World Trade Organization. So that dimension of US policy, which is how do you deal with the internal tensions in the United States that are leading to question the system, is very important. Where do these tensions come from? Only part of it comes from China, from the competition with China, although that's important. The other part, the other big part is, of course, the whole issue of unequal gains from international trade as perceived by a large part of the population. And some of that is correct, meaning that the integration into the trading system that has been a spectacular feature of the United States since 1945 has come after around the mid-80s with a large rise in income inequality and a lot of disruption at the lower end of the income scales. And of course, we as economists will argue that a large part of that had nothing much to do with international trade. It has more to do with technology and labor-saving innovation, et cetera.
Education.
But the fact is that it has been associated with international trade. And it's a lot easier to blame international trade and blame China in particular than to say, well, we don't like all this new technology.
And we haven't kept up with education. We've slipped quite a while.
There are many other associated features. One is perhaps on the education front, although I've always been somewhat skeptical of that explanation, partly because as a development economist, I look at the rest of the world, and United States population is actually very highly educated compared to a lot of other countries, and has tremendous skills.
You wouldn't know this from listening to our politicians. I don't know.
Yeah, but it's true that our advantage is narrower than it used to be on the education front. But the other feature is that unlike in Europe, particularly Northern Europe, but also all of Europe, really, the United States has very weak social safety nets. And, the unemployment coverage in the US is much weaker. The healthcare system is very dependent on your job, et cetera. This is not the case in other countries. So the effects of globalization on the US population, particularly at the lower end, are more directly felt than they are in other countries, I would say. Those are some of the features. So to summarize, there are three things. China is not really moving in the direction we want. Second, China has become a geopolitical rival to the United States. And third, the United States is not handling the whole globalization process particularly well or particularly happily.
So let me ask you this. So one thing is that, you can have a lot of smoke, but no real fire. And, we had Trump with his accusations about China and putting on tariffs in selected industries, and the Chinese retaliated, and then Biden has maintained some of these tariffs. Do they really amount to a hill of beans? Is this just political theater to make sure that, each side wants to claim that China's the bad guy or bad girl, and the biggie person, but is our trade with China just going along pretty much as ever, growing? Is the reality quite different from the rhetoric, is my question.
I agree basically with the thrust of your point, even though, as I say, the issues are real. I think they are exaggerated. 2 points there. One is the threat appears to me from China, the economic threat, much less than it was 10 years ago. And the numbers are really very telling here. I mean, China used to run at the peak at 10, 11% of GDP current account surplus, and used to accumulate foreign exchange reserves at an extraordinary rate. At one point, I think the foreign exchange reserves were like a quarter of GDP, often seen as a sign that it was undervaluing its currency. Now, China runs a current account surplus of around 2%, 2.5% of GDP, which is certainly not unusual. I mean, Germany, for example, or the Netherlands run, and many other countries run much larger current account surpluses. And its foreign exchange reserves are much lower today as a share of GDP. They're in the normal range.
Let me just interject for people that aren't necessarily economists, that the fact if China were running a huge current account surplus, it would mean it was had huge amounts of investment that it was doing abroad, and more or less starting to own everything abroad. We had this concern about Japan in the 1980s. Japan had lots of wealth. Their stock market was very high. We had lots of Japanese investment. The Japanese bought Rockefeller Center in New York City. That was viewed as a big shocker to the US. But then the Japanese economy kind of stagnated, and the stock market collapsed, and it still hasn't really fully recovered decades later. Everybody who thinks that the stock market is safe in the long run should take a look at the Japanese stock market that spent 30 years ending up lower after 30 years than it was to begin with, at least in nominal terms. So these concerns can get blown out of proportion. Does this mean that China is becoming much more consumption oriented in terms of its behavior? They're not saving as much, so therefore they don't have as much to invest abroad, and so therefore the investment in, let's say, the US or other parts of the developed world is not so much dependent on the Chinese. They don't have as much leverage. And with respect to this, China had this Belt and Road and Belt Initiative, Belt and Road Initiative, I forget the name.
The Belt and Road, yes.
Belt and Road, where they're doing a lot of investing in Africa. Has that cooled off? I've heard references that that's the case, that they're actually pulling back because some of their investments haven't paid off. The other interesting thing that Uri just supplied us just the other day with the financial riddler. If you go to larrykotlikov.substack.com, one of the things that's there is not just these podcasts, but also the financial riddler and newsletters that I put out. And the financial riddler that we just posted was Yuri's creation. I played Tom Sawyer and got him to paint the fence. And he gave us a very interesting set of questions and answers about Africa. And one of the things he indicated is that the U.S. Invests only $8 billion in Africa. That's 49 countries. And its per capita GDP is about $1,100. Ours is over $70,000 per person in the U.S. So vastly different levels, living standards, huge continent. It's 2.5 times the U.S. in terms of size. And we're investing only $8 billion there a year. That's about $24 per American that we're putting in this vast continent where China has been putting a lot more money. $8 billion is less than a quarter of what we're giving to Ukraine in a given year for defending them against Putin's aggression. Anyway, speak to where you see China. Are they pulling back from Africa? Or are they? How do you see their policy right now?
So, first of all, as you said, they're much more consumption-oriented and becoming more so. And as a result of that, their export growth has slowed in a big way. So if you look at, for example, China presence in the United States, since the global financial crisis, Chinese exports have grown in nominal terms at about the same rate as US GDP. So we're no longer at the time of the great China shock, what it's called. We're much more in a sort of business as usual kind of situation. And this happened even before the tariffs were imposed. So that's an important aspect from the point of view of the United States. Now, as far as Africa is concerned, of course, as a development economist, I never took such a negative view of the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa. How could I? Isn't that what we are about in development?
Africa desperately needs investment. Thank God China's going
it desperately needs infrastructure investment, which the Chinese are very, very good at supplying, in which they have a long experience, and where the international community, frankly, has remarkably slowed its efforts over the last decades, in part because of all sorts of constraints that have been put on infrastructure investments, some of them very well justified. But a lot of them have gotten to the point where there's very little infrastructure investment and aid coming from the international community. So to me, the Belt and Road Initiative in Africa, and by the way, in Latin America as well, in parts of Central Asia, was always welcome. Of course, if you read it in geopolitical terms, every major power have their own version of the Monroe Doctrine. So United States doesn't like it, and certainly the Europeans don't like it, because for them, Africa is theirs. After all, until
it was theirs, yeah.
50 years ago, they basically ran Africa. So they don't like it. Is it continuing? I think it is very much continuing. China is by far now the largest investor in Africa, and I think in general in the developing world. And what they are doing, however, is they're becoming more selective, which is what they should be doing. in the way that they give money. And quite correctly, I think there was concern, there is still concern, that the Chinese were not doing enough due diligence. By which I mean that they were giving loans to countries without adequately assessing their capacity to repay, which, frankly, whatever the international aid community has not done, you can say that they're very good, World Bank, IMF, other development banks, at assessing country risk and at assessing, ability to repay. So for that reason, the Chinese have gotten into some trouble here and there, and of course have suffered quite a lot of political backlash because of it. But my expectation is that they will adjust, that they're going to get better at evaluating these situations.
So have you seen any great success?
They don't want to throw money away, like
Sure.
anybody else. They don't want to throw money away.
So we've had 70 years of, development efforts from the World Bank, the IMF. I guess the Europeans have also had their own initiatives, and now China. Is Africa just hopeless, or is Africa making progress? You wrote, one of the things in your Financial Riddler was a question about the per capita growth rate of GDP, per capita GDP growth rate in Africa. And you said that over the last 10 years, it's been 1.4%, the same as the US. That to me was quite remarkable. Even, I thought that Africa was kind of falling behind, but it sounds like they're keeping even. That's a good sign. And so the issue was, is all this all these efforts been basically for naught, or the Chinese, have they figured out the magic way to invest and actually do something real that it's really making a big difference? Do you know of any of their investment projects that have actually made a huge difference so far?
Yeah, I'm not looking at specific investments. I have no doubt that, quite a bit of what they're doing on infrastructure. I mean, what we're talking about is, pretty basic. We're talking about roads, ports. These facilitate international trade, including with China, by the way, and investment in power, electricity, et cetera, et cetera. Chinese have just agreed, by the way, not to invest in coal-powered electricity anymore, which is a good thing. So I have very little doubt that these are helping Africa, sort of in the majority of cases. The performance of Africa is, of course, the great development question of the time. We have to get Africa to develop because, as you wrote in the Financial Riddler, the population of Africa is growing at an extraordinarily rapid rate, and we're not too far away from a situation where the population of Africa will be, 5, 6, 7 times, I don't remember the numbers from the projections, bigger than the population of Europe, which is at its doorstep, and so
we should tell everybody that Africa's adding, it's already about the size population-wise of China. It's a little bit smaller, but it's adding another China in terms of population over the next 80 years.
Right.
2100, we're going to have, something like 3.2 billion Africans. And if they're
while the population of Europe is declining or likely to decline over the next 50, 100 years. So that's very important. Now, is Africa making progress? My answer is yes, it's making progress. It's not making progress fast enough. It could be doing a lot better. But when I say it's making progress, I'll point just to a couple of things. One is if you're looking at social indicators, life expectancy, education, primary education, education of girls, infant mortality, etc. You've seen very, very impressive improvements in those fundamental indicators of human well-being in Africa. The performance on incomes is, particularly per capita incomes, is less impressive. I mean, 1.4% in Africa at such a low level, about the same as in the United States in terms of growth rates, means, of course, that the absolute gap between the United States incomes and Africa incomes is getting wider all the time, okay? Because 1.4% of 70,000 is a lot bigger than 1.4% of 1,000. So it's not going fast enough. Here again, I need to qualify, because if you looked a little bit at economic history, you know, the United States and Europe didn't get rich the way China is getting rich, or the Asian countries are getting rich by growing at the extraordinary rate of 6, 7, 8, 9% a year. That's not the way we became rich, Larry. We in Europe and the US became rich essentially by going from zero growth sometime at the end of the 18th century to about 1%, 1.5% growth per capita. And so in historical terms, China is making progress even at 1% growth a year, especially with its very rapid population growth, 1.5%.
You mean Africa?
I'm sorry?
You said China. You meant Africa.
I meant Africa. Sorry, I meant Africa. But it's too slow. We could be doing a lot better. We should be doing a lot better.
So getting back to China, you know, have, you know, trade relations changed so much that you'd say things are materially different with respect to that we're now breaking into trade blocks, that the trade with China between the US and China has declined, and the China is now trading more with Russia and other regions, and that we're being cut out. Is any of that going on, or is that all myth? Is that all kind of back in the imagination of politicians?
Larry, it's happening, but so far it is what I would call, I don't know the way to describe it. It's marginal. It's the canary in the coal mine. It's the beginning. Overall, trade between Russia and China is very small for China. The US and Europe are far, far more important than immeasurably, almost immeasurably so, for China than is Russia. Russia is, of course, very interesting for China because it's a geopolitical partner and all that, and a different system, and it kind of has, but it has decided, China has decided that there's a greater affinity with Russia than with the West for various reasons. Not all of which have to do with Russia and China, some of which have to do with the way the West is reacting to China. But anyway, the decoupling between the US and China shouldn't be called decoupling because it's not really decoupling, but there is a reorientation of trade at the margin from the United States and China towards third partners. Okay, so if you like, one way to think about it is the market share of China in the US is declining, and the market share of the US in China is declining a little bit. It's beginning. And it's obviously going to continue on that path given present policies, particularly in anything to do with technology and dual use, defense sensitive products, et cetera, et cetera. We're clearly moving in the right direction. Far less evident that this is not evident in China's trade with Europe, with Western Europe. It's not evident in China's trade with Japan, which is another US ally. But it is already you're beginning to see it in the relationship with the United States. People don't realize just how important China has become in many instances. I mean, Japan now trades far more with China than it does with the United States. And Germany's trade with China is now about the same as the United States, as with the United States. And
Chile is also trading more. There's other countries, as you said, something like 140 countries that are trading.
Yeah. So for many developing countries, like, for example, Brazil, important developing countries, Brazil, Indonesia, etc., China is far more important now as a trading partner than the United States is.
So do you see, getting into the geopolitics, do you see China, going the distance of actually helping Russia militarily with its flagging efforts to destroy and occupy Ukraine? Do you see China invading Taiwan in the context of a U.S. which is preoccupied with helping Ukraine? If China were to invade Taiwan, do you see the U.S. getting involved in terms of putting boots on the ground or shooting down or sinking Chinese warships with our submarines? How do you see things evolving, or is this just a lot of hot air and a Cold War?
Larry, I'm an economist like you. You're taking me into unfamiliar territory here. My impression, and you should talk to some very wise people who deal with these issues, international relations, all the time. My impression is that China certainly does not want to precipitate a situation either in Ukraine or in Taiwan. And this is for very good reason in China's case. Number one, because China is still very much a developing country. Again, people don't realize that the per capita income of China today is between 1/3 and 1/4 that of the United States. It has a very large poor population in its western provinces and in the fringes of its extraordinarily successful metropolises. So China needs to grow, needs to develop. It's getting older. The working population is slowing. Chinese economic growth is slowing. They need stability and they need economic growth. They don't want, a conflagration either in Europe or certainly not in the Taiwan Straits. Now, that is my reading of Chinese intentions. Other people will take different views. But, of course, it all depends on how the international context develops, right? And I do believe that if the Chinese began to feel that Taiwan was moving outside their orbit in an irreversible way. And this was prompted partly by the United States. It's not happening, by the way. I don't think it's happening. There are less and less countries that have that recognize Japan, that recognize Taiwan as a separate country from China, and the United States officially also does not officially. But if that were to happen, they're very, very sensitive to that issue, and so you can't exclude the possibility that they'll say, "Okay, we have to move now." But I don't think that's likely, and I think the United States is also, at least under the Biden administration, going to be quite cautious on that, because Larry, you and I grew up a little bit, overlap quite a bit with the Vietnam era. Do you really think today's American boys and girls want to get involved into a major war with China over an island that is a few tens of miles off the Chinese landmass? And do you really think that we want to go into a war with China, which could turn into a nuclear conflict over an island that we recognize officially today as being part of China?
No, I think
it's called the One China policy.
I think the rhetoric can get in front of us, and we can get to a point where
we can. Yeah,
we think that if Taiwan is taken over, the Chinese are being very aggressive about the South China Sea, building up the military there. And then of course there's South Korea that they could then try and pick off. Japan. If the U.S. were to sit back and let China take over Taiwan without any real response, then the concern would be a domino type story that all of Southeast Asia will become a province of China, and then we've got Australia and New Zealand, and then the U.S. is really kicked out of this Pacific arena. That may ultimately be, that transformation, and for the Chinese being much more influential than the U.S., probably would happen anyway without any military overtones, if things are just allowed to proceed peacefully, because China, once its per capita GDP reaches our level and their productivity growth, they will be about 2.5 times our economy. They're going to be the economic hegemon. I have a paper on my website, kotlikov.net, called The Future of Global Economic Power. Apparently, a lot of people in China have read it, because I keep getting exchanges from them. But it's just basically just kind of putting together in a global model, a standard economic life cycle model, the demographics. The demographics are not great for China, as you said. Its population is going to decline by 400 million people to basically more than the U.S. has today by the end of the century. On the other hand, if its productivity catches up, which is what recent history would suggest, they could end up with really a third of world output, or at least 25, 27% of world output, whereas we'll be around 11, 12% of world output. And right now, by some measures, we're at the same level, where China's a little bit larger, with the European Union being even a larger regional economy than either of the two at the moment. So can we, or should we kind of lower the rhetoric? Making China our enemy rhetorically, even if on the ground we're not actually stopping trade in a fundamental way, is this exactly the wrong strategy? Because the more we are connected with China economically, it seems to me the higher the price tag of they are engaging in the aggressive behavior that we read as they're engaging in. And what do you make of that? That's my view, that we should be.
Well, it's my view, Larry. We agree. I mean, I think the conflict with China is overplayed, and there's too much balance of power, 19th century, 20th century thinking about China's rise. Some of it has been encouraged by some very smart people who, historians and analysts, et cetera, et cetera. China has one overriding objective, national objective, which is what they call the reunification with Taiwan. And that has been their objective, continues to be their objective.
So,
question is whether the United States wants to put that at the center of the China relationship.
it
Or
seems to me that we should have our leaders, at least President Biden, who's seems like the only adult in the political arena here at the moment in terms of the comparing Republican leadership with Biden. So Biden seems to me he should be coming out and saying, look, we are of the view that China ultimately will be united together with Taiwan under one umbrella, but this needs to be worked out through time by the two sides so that both sides are comfortable and do this on a voluntary basis, and that there not be and this is really, and what I'm saying is what President Xi has said publicly, we don't want to take over Taiwan, and that so we support that. I think if he were to say this repeatedly and publicly and loudly, that it would lower the temperature, and maybe the quid pro quo with the Chinese would start backing down on some of their vitriolic moves in the South China, in the in the Strait of Taiwan, where they're, I guess that's what it's called, where they're sending fighter flight planes across to harass the Taiwanese. This is really what's needed. Grown-ups in the room. She seems to be pretty disappointing in this respect because, I think everybody had high hopes that he was going to be less chauvinistic and be more of a statesman. Maybe he's moving in this direction. We just did negotiate a peace agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Who would have expected that to happen, right? Maybe he can actually help in dealing with Ukraine. My view would be that China and Russia should form a NATO alliance of their own and give Russia the face saving to withdraw from Ukraine, because they now are no longer threatened by NATO because they have Chinese backing, and that would be kind of a simple solution here that would, and they could also lease back Crimea in the process, and maybe with some option to buy in 100, 200 years, but no guaranteed to buy. Something like that. It seems like we're not thinking sufficiently out of the box, but we're coming kind of to the end of the hour here. Give me your final thinking on this.
Yeah. Look, my reading on China is they have two objectives. They have an international objective, which is the reunification, as they call it, with Taiwan. And they have perhaps the overriding of all objectives, which is that the Chinese Communist Party stays in power. And I think in the end, the United States would be wise to recognize that both those things matter enormously to the Chinese and find a way of accommodating that. If you have a US policy which says, if the Chinese try to take over Taiwan, we will defend Taiwan, which President Biden has said at least 4 times, and then was sort of backed out by his surrounding advisors, the State Department, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if formal US policy is, which again, Biden has said repeatedly, is, we are an alliance of democracies and we want democracy above, that is our fundamental objective. Both of these are unacceptable for the Chinese. And so the question, and again, it's not so much a question for economists, it's a question for the political scientists, is this really so important to the US interests? Is that where US interests really lie? In the defense of Taiwan and in trying to make China like us. They're not like us.
And if we had John Bolton on next, sitting next to you, former ambassador to the UN, and I guess he was a national security advisor under Trump for a while. I think he would say in response that we are being naive, that China's trying to take over all of Southeast Asia, that they're building up a navy at an incredibly rapid rate. Their navy already exceeds our navy. It will be maybe 30% bigger in 20 years. That they have developed these hypersonic missiles that can take out our aircraft carriers and our 11 aircraft carriers in the course of a nanosecond, maybe more than that. But the South China Sea activity is indicative of what they really were trying to do, and that we're being naive with respect to thinking about China as potentially a long, good partner that's got this little pet peeve that we should accommodate. How would you respond to Bolton if he were saying these things?
Well, to me, that's an example of what I said, which is 19th century, 20th century balance of power thinking, the domino theory, which did not serve us well in Vietnam. I would say that the war, perhaps the most important point, is the war in Ukraine, where Russia was just gonna, come over the border and take over Ukraine in 3 days. Shows the limitations nowadays of this kind of thinking. And, the idea that the Chinese will sail across the East China Sea or the North China Sea, whatever it's called, to take over Japan is laughable. Or Vietnam for that matter, or India for that matter. I mean, it just, to me, it doesn't make any sense. And that, of course, if you have somebody crazy like an Adolf Hitler, at the top of the Chinese hierarchy, I suppose this would be a conceivable scenario. I mean, it wouldn't be conceivable in the sense it would never succeed, but you could imagine a war along those lines. But I don't see any rational Chinese policymaker today, and if anything, Xi he has many faults, but I don't think he's stupid.
And I don't think
yeah. So no, frankly, I don't see that risk. I just don't see it. But again, Larry, you're taking me outside my zone of comfort. I like to talk about supply and demand.
Yeah, but I like to hear from you because I think you're a font of geopolitical wisdom in addition to economic knowledge and foresight. So this has been a terrific exchange as ever. I do want to remind you that we did tie in chess many years ago. And we should really
You know,
not be forgetting
I
that
should give you another chance.
yet again. It's etched very firmly in my brain. So anyway, you were probably under the water. You were probably ill that day. So thanks again, Uri. We'll get you back on here again and take care. Many thanks.
Okay, take care, Larry. Thanks a lot. We'll talk soon. Bye,
Talk
my
soon.
friend. Bye.